All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Humans of Kings Mountain. Ranger Leah here, representing Kings Mountain National Military Park, and I'm very excited to be having a conversation today with Arthur Broady, who is a descendant of one of the Kings Mountain participants, John Broddy. All right, Arthur, can you tell us a little bit about who John Broddy is?
Yes, thank you, Leah. Yes, John is my sixth great-grandfather. John lived in Smyth County in that area. He was born around 1750. The earliest that we can locate any data on John was when he was around 4 or 5 years old. And he shows up as being the property of Charles Campbell. Charles Campbell was a prominent member of that community during that period of time. Also, Charles had a young son named William, who later became known as Colonel William Campbell, famous commander of the militia that defeated the British, the Loyalists, at the Battle of Kings Mountain. But John was the property of Charles and remained the property of Charles until Charles died. And then it became the property of William. So in fact, all of John's life as a slave, during the time he was a slave, he was the property of the Campbells, and he never moved very far from Smyth County during that time. So we're very fortunate to know about John, because if it had not been for the Battle of Kings Mountain, the 45-minute, an hour-long battle, we would know nothing about John's life. And I like to point out the fact that John is supposedly lived to be 100 or 105 years old. So when you take into account that 1 hour of John's life provided us with the opportunity to learn about a life that lasted over 100 years. So we are very indebted to Kings Mountain for that reason. Okay.
Was John eventually granted his freedom after William Campbell died?
Yes, the death of William Campbell included a will that William had prepared that stipulated that upon William's death, John would receive his emancipation papers as a gesture of thanks for serving him specifically during the Revolutionary War. It took about 12 years before John was actually emancipated. When William died, John became the property of his daughter, who was married to Francis Preston, another prominent member of that community. John was owned by Sarah and Francis, and about 12 years later, Francis took the paperwork, the will, to the county courthouse in Smyth County and processed it, and John received his freedom. That's kind of an odd situation, since it took 12 years for John to get his freedom. Okay. And
why do you think that was the case? And I ask from doing a little bit of research where African Americans who had served on the Patriot side in the Revolution, sometimes it did take years in court action for it to actually occur, and some were not successful in receiving their freedom.
We've speculated that perhaps one or two, maybe three reasons for that. One is that John only knew life with his association with the Campbells. That's the only place he had to live. That was his universe, essentially, was the Campbells. And we're not sure where John would have gone if he was freed. His family, his circle of friends, all resided right there with the Campbells. The second explanation that we've come up with is, I haven't confirmed this, but we believe that during that time, there was a law in Virginia that stated that if you were free, you had to move out of the state. You could not be a freed slave living in the state of Virginia. I've read that a couple of places. I haven't confirmed the timing of that to see if that met that condition. So, and I think the third thing was that if you were free, I tell people you can't walk around with a sandwich sign on that says "I'm free" and everybody starts treating you differently. Even though you're free, if you don't move, you're going to be treated, because that's all anyone ever knew you were, was a slave. So those are three reasons we think that may contribute to the amount of time that took place.
Thank you. Did Broddy have military service during the Revolutionary War? Are there instances other than the Battle of Kings Mountain where he served, or in what capacity did he serve?
His capacity that he served at the Battle of Kings Mountain was as a body servant. He was, again, very closely associated with Campbell. I've read that Campbell's wife, Elizabeth, insisted on John joining Campbell on this particular trip, specifically for the purpose of watching over him and protecting him if at all possible. The role that he had on Kings Mountain was to take care of Campbell's horse, which was a very skittish, reported to be a skittish horse. It did not like gunfire, those kinds of things. So John was tasked to be responsible for Campbell's horse. The other reason was John was given Campbell's coat. This was a militia, and certainly the majority of the men did not have uniforms. They were not in uniform. They were not officially military people. Campbell did wear a coat, and he preferred not to wear his coat into battle because it would be like putting a target on his back. So John had the responsibility of taking care of the horse and Colonel Campbell's coat, and that was pretty much his role while on the mountain. There are reports that John felt very obligated, responsible for Campbell, and at a certain point during the battle, he could no longer detect where Campbell was, and so he left his post. He took the horse, rode the horse into battle. He was under fire, being fired at by the enemy, because he was trying to locate to make sure Campbell was safe. He did find Campbell, and he did return back to his post, but he is credited for being in the battle at some point during that 45-50-minute battle. We have not confirmed other locations where John may have been along with Campbell. We believe he was. We just don't have any reference of that. And a little later on, I'll try to explain why we think that may be the case. Okay.
You've hinted at the controversy that brought a lot to light about who John Broddy is, and it's the Shelby Campbell controversy. Can you tell us about that controversy and what it told us about Broddy?
Yes, thanks for asking that question, because again, I credit Colonel Shelby, Isaac Shelby, as being the primary cause that we know anything about John. Colonel Shelby was one of the commanders at Kings Mountain during the battle, and later he became the first governor of Kentucky. There was a second and third governor, and then he ran again to be the fourth governor of Kentucky. At the time he was running for governor to be the fourth governor, we were approaching the War of 1812, and the Colonel Campbell wanted to beef up his military resume, and because his constituents really wanted a strong military person because of what appeared to be looming on the horizon was the Battle of 1812. He claimed that Campbell was not the hero that he had claimed to be, that he was in fact observed by him sitting on a horse off in the distance. And so when he made that claim, he claimed that this famous commander, William Campbell, really wasn't a hero. In fact, he charged him with being a coward. This was a very interesting dilemma for historians who by this time had written up the Battle of Kings Mountain and thought they knew everything there was about it and had praised Campbell for what he had done. So the historians got busy. They wanted to know what was the basis for this. And in fact, they found out that from Campbell's men that he was in fact in the heat of the battle, and that they were, especially those that came from Abingdon, they were familiar with Campbell and familiar with John, and they confirmed that John was in fact the one in charge of the horse. Okay, so that became the claim. Of course, by this time Campbell had been dead for 30 years when this claim was made, but there was a finding. There was basically three findings from that controversy. One of the findings was, of course, that Campbell was in fact in the battle and that it was John on the horse. The second finding was that there was enough similarity between John, resemblance between John and Campbell, that it could easily have been mistaken identity. It looked like Campbell on the horse wearing a military jacket, and the horse belonged to Campbell. So it was may have been a very honest mistake that was made. About 100 years later, there's another. That was a Lyman Draper. I'm sure you're familiar with Lyman Draper.
Oh yes.
That was Lyman Draper's finding, but about 100 years later, another historian, Gordon Aronimi, I think I pronounced that hopefully correctly, he came up with another conclusion in that Campbell and John were not related. And that theory became a very popular theory because of a book that was written by Campbell's granddaughter published in 1961, as a matter of fact, called Paths of Glory. And in this book, which is fictional, this book is actually the memoirs or the journal that belonged to Campbell's wife, Elizabeth. And I'm sure you know, Elizabeth was Patrick Henry's sister. Mm-hmm. And there was a problem with Patrick Henry's sister, Elizabeth, and their daughter, Sarah. After Campbell died, Elizabeth remarried General Russell, and she became known as Madam Russell. And Sarah did not like that fact, and so they became estranged. Elizabeth wrote a journal to explain her life. She did this for the benefit of her daughter, and 6 generations later, the granddaughter, Nellie Preston, gathers up these papers and puts it in a book. And so there's numerous accounts of John in this book. And one of the accounts is that John explains where he thought he came from. And it was not Africa, and it was not Southwest Virginia. It was India, of all places. So the second historian brought that to light, and this is one of the things that we have been researching and trying to confirm. It makes a big difference to us. Are we descendants of the Campbells? Are we descendants of people from Africa? Or are we descendants from people from India? What are we? So it's an important for us to try to nail that down.
Certainly. And that's a very interesting theory that I had not heard before you and I were emailing back and forth. What I was familiar with was Draper's work, where he talked about that I think it was Cleveland had been joking before the battle, pretending to think that Broddy was Campbell, and so the insinuation was that they were somehow related.
Yes.
So that's really interesting. And
Yeah.
I know you wanted to kind of put out an appeal to our viewers if they had information about that
Yes.
that journal.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I do appeal to anyone who has any knowledge of Nellie Preston. Nellie Preston, as I said, is the granddaughter of William Campbell and Elizabeth Campbell, and she's the one who compiled the book. Unfortunately, the book is considered a fiction because there's really no way to confirm a lot of that information. Although it's interesting, when I was on the mountain there at Kings Mountain, the book describes the positions of all of the military units at the bottom before they attacked Ferguson, and they match up with exactly everything that you know about the positions of those different segments of the forces that were there. So we know that there's parts of the book that are just absolutely as accurate as they can be, but we cannot get over the hurdle of it being classified as a fiction. And if we can ever find the papers, Nellie's working papers or Elizabeth's original journal, we can tell whether or not Nellie made this up or whether, in fact, this was the case. So I appeal to anybody out there who's a Preston or a Campbell or anything in between who's got any understanding or any interest in Nellie or the Prestons, please let me know. Thank you for that plug.
Sure. And that kind of feeds into our next question, which is, what is the most interesting thing you've discovered in your research?
I believe that was probably the things that you can't resolve tend to be the things you continue to have energy for. I was very happy to see information that said John was educated. John was well thought of. John lived a very different, unusual life than most slaves did at that period of time. When John was freed, he was not only given his freedom, he was given property by the Campbells so that his family could move on that property with him. There were still slaves that were owned by his wife, Elizabeth. She freed slaves at the same time John was freed because they were part of John's family. So all those things were very interesting to read. But the thing that just keeps us awake at night is, where are those papers? Mm-hmm. I've been to Virginia Tech. I've been to other places trying to track down these documents because, the Prestons have a connection to Virginia Tech. They donated the property to Virginia Tech. That property originally belonged to the Prestons. And so they donated the property so Virginia Tech could be built, and there's still a piece of that property that belongs to the Prestons, and they have a beautiful museum there with all kinds of material, and but they just don't know anything about the book. It's amazing. So that's the most interesting thing. I would go across this country if I could find one person that knows anything about the whereabouts of those papers. So keep a look at it.
It seems like history kind of always pitches us those little mysteries that are going to tug and nag until hopefully more research is found. When you and I were conversing back and forth via email about possibilities surrounding John's origin, You had mentioned that for William and John to be so close, it would have been kind of outside the realm of what standard practices were among slave owners who fathered enslaved children. So if Charles was John's father, can you explain more about what would have been more of an accepted practice?
Yes, thank you again for that question. One of the best examples I can give you is the life of Frederick Douglass. It followed the norm, Frederick Douglass's life. If a slave owner, certainly a married slave owner with a family, fathered a child out of wedlock with the help of a slave woman, the practice would have been to remove one or both of them from the family, from the center of the family, or from the family where they would be, as I say, reminders that there had been something that had happened that should not have happened. Okay. In the case of Frederick Douglass, the slave master was his father, and Frederick was sent off to live with his grandparents, what was believed to be his grandparents. And the mother was sent off so that she would not be in close proximity. It's very difficult to believe that Charles would have been the father of William, and that Charles would have kept William that close to the family, even to the point where he became good friends with his half brother. Okay, that just sort of does not fall within the tradition or the practice at that time for him to remain close and a part of that family. There was another reason why, and that is because often slave owners had sons, and that it would put them in a very precarious position to have to discipline your half brother, or to be, a lot of times their sons were overseers of their plantation, and they were responsible for the discipline, or the father was responsible for the discipline, and they never wanted to put themselves or any of their children in the position of having to, essentially beat, torture a member of their family. So to keep all of that as not a possibility, they typically shipped out those two away from the families, the immediate family. So I'm just of the mindset that it's highly unlikely that John would have been Campbell's half brother, and because of the prestige, the reputation, and the just the culture of that time, John would not have been running around looking like Campbell and claiming to be his half brother.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned in our emails and in your biography that you grew up a short distance from where William Campbell and the Campbell family and other historical figures are now, or where they were operating and where they're now buried, without ever knowing your ties to them. So how did you get involved in that history?
How I technically got involved in it was that I had an uncle that was a retired school teacher from New York City, and he grew up in West Virginia, and they're not that far from Smyth County. But apparently he had heard over the years that there was this descendant, this ancestor that we had, and possibly he was freed. So he began pursuing that possibility, and was the one, in fact, who found the Emancipation Papers located in Smyth County, 2 blocks from where I grew up. Okay. But that inspired him to go on and look more at our ancestors and began building the family tree. But he passed away, and because I was one of his favorite nephews, I ended up with his research, and I began looking at it and found it very interesting, and then I began to pursue it myself. But yes, I grew up. I used to pass by historical markers that had Kings Mountain written on it and William Campbell's names on it, and never knew it had anything to do. In fact, I did my student teaching at an elementary school called Kings Mountain Elementary School and never made the connection, of course. So I've just, there's a museum in Abingdon, Virginia that features my grandfather. I don't even know about that. So it's just been an amazing experience. And all of this has been, where Campbell is buried, it's less than 7 miles from my home. So in Aspenvale. And you folks come there every September, I think.
We do.
October, and you do a memorial service for Campbell and for John Broddy. And that's how I met Ranger Slaughter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I did it a couple of years ago, and I could not manage to make it to John Broddy's because I got completely lost. But I did make it to Aspenvale to Campbell's, and that was something special. One of these days, I will actually find John Broddy's grave and be able to see it.
And by the way, Nellie's buried there also.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, she's buried in that cemetery. So.
Well, you and I first actually met back in 2016 when a local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution were working to place a marker honoring the African American Patriots on our battlefield, and they successfully did that on October 7th, 2016, which features John Broddy's name on the marker. Can you tell us about your experience on that day? Well,
it was a wonderful day. And you may remember, I believe it was Hurricane Nate or something that just came through a few days.
Yep.
Was it Matthew?
Yep.
Just a few days before, and so we had torrential rains that day up on that mountain, but it didn't dampen our enthusiasm. And of course, we owe Loretta Cozart a great deal of thanks for I think almost a 7-year effort to get the marker approved, constructed, delivered, placed. That was a tremendous effort that she made, and I'm glad to say that she and I have remained friends, because I think I think it took a lot of courage and endurance to go through the red tape that something like that's required. But yes, to be able to meet her for the first time face to face, and to be there with some of my family members, it was a wonderful experience. I won't ever forget it. And I have tons of photos from it that I take around to do my speeches. So I might even have you in one of those pictures. I might have to go back to look.
It was a very special day in spite of Hurricane Matthew.
Yeah.
I have one final kind of wrap up question that I think it can apply to my work and to how we do history in the National Park Service and as a country. And it's, how do you think that we can better highlight stories like that of John Broddy? What can we do to make sure that we are telling the whole story and giving a look at the complete picture, even if it might be uncomfortable?
Thanks for asking that question. One thing that I've learned doing this research is that I didn't know a lot. And my friends hear me say, you don't know what you don't know. You just don't know what you don't know. And I have become an history buff in this later life of mine. I wish I was 50 years ago, but what you're doing, things like this helps. But there is so much history around slaves and freed slaves during the Revolutionary War that has never made it to the history books. I just keep reading and reading, and I'm finding things I've never heard of before. They're just not there, and this is the only way today that's available to share that information. We only know, I took a quick inventory. I only know of Crispus Attucks, and it's amazing that Crispus Attucks, other than being around at the time that the massacre started, he never fought. I mean, but that's who we know. That's who we know. So, but there are a lot of others that we should be aware of, and not only for the Patriots. There were a lot more loyalists fighting in that war than patriots, and what their lives were like once the war was over is a unbelievable story, and it marched us right up to the Civil War. So 100 years later, so that's what you can do to answer your question, is to keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time so much and getting a glimpse into this participant at Kings Mountain. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
And I thank you very much. Best wishes to you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.